Hello, I'm the Media Wiz, because one art form wasn't enough, and like many other vlog videos I've done, I thought about doing this as a different kind of video. Originally I planned it as a review, then for a while I tried doing it as a commentary, but my commentary wasn't that interesting, so I figured that I might as well just do this as a vlog video, as a way to say, yeah, I saw this movie and give some quick thoughts on it. It's a movie I wanted to talk about for a while. It's this 1977 TV movie that kind of hopped on the Jawsploitation bandwagon. I think more specifically it falls under that whole animals strike back subgenre of animals getting revenge on people. In this case, it's just as the title says it is, it's about ants, and ants getting revenge on people. The movie goes by a couple of different titles. Ants is just one of them, and I find it funny because, yes, years after the fact, we then got a theatrical movie released by DreamWorks, which is Ants. The same movie title, except it has a Z instead. But it goes by a couple of other alternate titles. It's like Panic at Lakewood Manor and It Happened at Lakewood Manor. But I'm going to call it Ants because the copy of the movie that I found has that as the title. Now, first off, I want to point out, despite this being a TV movie and it having a relatively low budget, they actually have a decent amount of like big names in this movie. I mean, you have Linda Day George, Myrna Loy is in it, Brian Dennehy, Robert Foxworth is like the main guy in it. You have the son of Dick Van Dyke, Ernie Casey. Like, there's a bunch of people in this movie who've had decent careers, and they've all come together to be in a movie about ants. And I also want to point out, the same year this came out, there was a movie based on the H.G. Wells novel Empire of the Ants. But that was a theatrical film, as far to my knowledge, so yeah, it's interesting that apparently not only was the whole animal strike back subgenre becoming a thing, but people had a hot nut for ants. Now, unlike something like Jaws, which has a pretty straightforward cast of characters, you know, you got the three main guys in it. You got Brody, you got Hooper, and you got Quint. And then you got a couple of other characters. Obviously, there's the beast they go up against, which is the shark in Jaws. There's the mayor. There's Brody's family. You know, in the first one, it was like his wife and son. In this movie, you have a ton of different characters running around, all competing for screen time. And some of them are given more screen time than others. But of course, the main duo that we focus on the most are this young couple. You have Robert Foxworth, who plays this guy who's in construction, and his girlfriend is this one lady who is related to this woman who owns a place called Lakewood Manor, which she says was originally built by her husband. They eventually converted it into this like bed and breakfast type place. And like I said, there is just so many different characters that come to this place, and everyone's given these big grandiose introductions, and some of them you think are going to be like reoccurring characters all throughout the movie. Some of them just disappear. Like, for example, there's this boy and his mother, and they have a couple lines of dialogue that insinuate that the father in their family left. So that means like the lady's husband and the kid's dad. Like they have like a quick line or two about how he left them, and they have a part where the kid is trying to gather up bottles so that way he can make money to try and like look out for his mom. And then later the kid is one of the first victims of the ants because he then falls into a swimming pool because he has all the ants all over him, and then he drowns, I guess, or he's hauled off to a hospital. Like, we just never see them again. We don't see the mom, and we don't see that kid. There's another guy who works as a landscaper, and he comes across this girl who's backpacking, and they like immediately fall for one another. They have like a couple of lines of banter back and forth when they first meet. She says that she needs to stop in to this place to get a shower, and then she'll be out of there. But of course, they keep hitting it off every time. And eventually they have sex, I guess. We don't have a gratuitous sex scene because, after all, this is a TV movie in the 70s. So all you can really see is the aftermath of these things, where people are like, you know, cuddle up next to each other, which comes into play with yet another group of characters, because another group we have is this slimy businessman and his partner. I guess they were dating. I don't know, because like, when they first introduce them, they say that they're business partners, and then he starts to make advances towards her, and then she says like that they're partners in business and otherwise. I mean, I guess they were in a relationship because later on in the movie, before the big ant outbreak happens, it shows them in bed and they just had sex. And then they keep establishing this guy as being so unlikable. And that's one of the things about old horror movies is back then you could only have like one, maybe two characters be absolute assholes who you want to see get it. And then usually they'd have the rest of the cast be generally likable, so that way it would be more sad when the characters eventually got killed. The worst horror movies always had this problem where you'd have almost all the characters be unlikable except maybe the main characters. And everyone else is just obnoxious, unlikable, and you don't care when they die. However, this movie doesn't have that problem. All the characters are generally likable, but they just keep establishing this guy as just being an absolute slime ball, and he's one of the people you're just waiting for to get it. And he does, much later on, near the end of the movie, but I digress. But yeah, all throughout the movie, he's just constantly mouthing off to the people that work at this place. You know, he talks down to everyone. There are several scenes where he fights with his lady companion because she says that she wants to be treated like an equal, like, I guess in their business. Because there are parts where he just like condescendingly talks down to her, and then she finally stands up to him. And keep in mind, this is the after sex scene, as I call it. Yeah, after they had sex and they're talking to each other, they're like about to get into a fight, and then eventually they just like kind of talk down. And it's like, okay, well, I guess enough of that. And one of the many scenes in this movie that are just abruptly ended. There are tons of scenes where they just kind of have characters stop talking, they look at each other, and then next thing, there's tons of scenes that are like that. There's also this lady who works as like she's part of the board of directors, I think is what they say. She works in health, and she, along with this other guy who basically becomes the token scientist character, he's the one that rattles through exposition in the middle of the movie about what's going on with these ants. But we'll get to him in a sec. But yeah, so this lady, she's supervising over the construction site that Robert Foxworth and Bernie Casey are working at. Because at the very beginning of the movie, they like right off the bat, you're given a preview as to what's to come. Because you see one of the guys in this construction site, he goes down in an area that's said to be like blocked off, and it's an area that has like scaffolding being put in. He goes down there and comes across another guy who has a bunch of ants all over him. He tries to help him out, and then they both get buried under a bunch of rubble. And then by the 20-minute mark later, after this point, like I said, this is the beginning of the movie. 20 minutes after that, we then see the guys at the construction crew. They call in an ambulance, they have them taken away. One guy died, and the other one's like just barely breathing. And so from there, like, it is a long period of time until we eventually get back to the ants. Because then the next kill is like, I think, I don't know, like probably 35, 40 minutes into the film. You see this chef guy who, despite being a chef, he doesn't have like a chef's hat or even like, I mean, he doesn't have much hair, so probably doesn't need a hairnet. But it's interesting, this guy who's clearly the chef is walking around with sandals. I thought that was kind of strange, but whatever. But he's the next one to go, and they have an admittedly kind of gross visual of a bunch of ants flooding out of a kitchen sink. So yeah, that's kind of creepy. And of course, in between the opening kill and this guy's death, you have the scene of this kid, you know, dumpster diving for bottles, and then he, you know, gets covered in ants and then runs into the swimming pool, even though he can't swim, and then he gets hauled off later. But so yeah, like these, like the first three kills are like very spaced out between each other, and then once you actually figure out why the ants are doing this, it's kind of just brushed over. I mean, they say like these are a specific type of ants who have like a poisonous venom, and since the ants are not very aggressive creatures, if you're the one to provoke them, then that's what makes them attack. So yeah, people, as soon as they get these ants all over them, they try to get them off as soon as possible. And they say that one probably won't kill you, a couple of bites won't kill you, but if 50, if not 100 of these ants kill you, it's like instant death, is what they say. And some of the rules are fairly inconsistent, because they say that water won't kill them, but fire will, so that's why they're dousing the house at the end in fire to try and kill them off. But then there's like a crowd of people that are watching this, And once a helicopter lands, it blows a bunch of ants onto these people, and then they get hosed down, and that just stops them. Even though earlier they said that you can't kill them with water, that I was confused by that. I'm like, is that helping, or is that just like a misguided attempt at trying to stop them that isn't going to work? But I guess it does work, because after that it seems like everyone was still there. So yeah, so I guess they're mostly killed by fire, and only sometimes they're killed with water. Really, most of this movie, until the third act, when it starts to ramp up the amount of ants that are all over this place. Like, first it's just a couple hundred of them, and then eventually they keep having it that there's ants all over the walls, all over the ceilings. They start getting onto people's bodies everywhere. More characters start dying left and right, including that one lady friend of the slimeball business guy. Yeah, she dies. She's like one of the first ones of the main characters to die. And then at that point they realize that, oh, if we need to set this place on fire to kill these kind of ants off. And I'm glad they didn't try to half-ass an environmentalist message, because that would have been the last thing I wanted out of a movie like this. But there is a quick throwaway line from the scientist dude who says something like, you know, oh, well, ants inhabited the earth long before humans did, so we're encroaching on their territory. And I'm just like, please tell me they're not going to try and, like, crowbar in an environmentalist message, because, like, then that would have been the ultimate, like, birdemic move, but thankfully they didn't. It's just kind of like, okay, these ants are a specific breed of ants. And it's interesting because they even say that there's a specific breed of ants in Africa that are deadly, and it made me then think, if this movie was a little bit more big budget, maybe they could have made a movie about that. Have it be that there are some scientists in Africa, they go over to study some animals, or maybe even study insects that are over there, and then there's this horrible outbreak of ants, and maybe you half-ass some kind of moral about, oh, we shouldn't be encroaching on insects' territory or whatever. Near the end, they really start taking their sweet time on a lot of this stuff. Like, okay, the backpacker girl, she wants to get out as soon as possible, and near the end of the movie, this is when they realize they have to set the place on fire to kill these things. But they have to also get the characters out of there, so they have a fire truck roll up with one of those extending ladders, but she says she doesn't want to go because she's afraid of heights. Then they eventually convince her to go out there, and there's like a good 5 minutes of her hanging on for dear life on this extender ladder until they eventually get her, you know, back onto the ground and out of the building. And it feels like it goes on for a while. It wasn't as boring as something like Manos: The Hands of Fate, which felt like it took forever and a half to watch, but it was just so bizarre that this was taking so long. And because then I checked the runtime, I'm like, oh wait, now I know why they're dragging this out. We got 20 minutes left of this movie, and we're whittling down to like 5 characters who need to get out of this building. So yeah, it takes her a while to get out of there. And this is the helicopter part I mentioned earlier. This helicopter flies away, blows a bunch of dust and stuff on the ground onto these people who were evacuated from the building. That was a whole thing at the beginning too. The old lady said she didn't want to sell the place because the businessman was trying to buy it from her, so that way he can make a fortune. To sell it to somebody else. She didn't want to sell it at the beginning, but of course, now that this horrible ant outbreak happens, now she wants to sell it at the end and move to Florida and be with her sister. That was a whole thing, but regardless. So yeah, once they get the backpacker girl out of there, and they get Myrna Loy out of there, basically the end of the movie comes down to, you got 3 characters left. You got slimy business douchebag, Robert Foxworth as the construction worker, and the girl who he's in love with, who is like the daughter of the lady that owns the building. So they have to sit in the middle of this room, which is swarming with ants. They're all over the walls, all over the ceiling. And the scientist guy over the phone tells them, hey, since ants aren't naturally aggressive creatures, just don't provoke them. What you have to do is breathe less heavily, and don't move, and don't make a sound. Slowly but surely, ants start working their way onto their bodies, and then the slimy business douche can't handle it, and so what he does is he runs to the balcony. He sees the swimming pool is there. He tries to jump into it, and in one of the many awkwardly edited scenes in this movie, it shows him just barely leap, and then it shows all these people reacting like, And then, like, some people, it shows them, like, looking, like, following as he falls. And then, you know, you don't see him hit the ground. And there's no blood because, once again, this is a TV movie from the 70s. So that kind of thing was a big no-no. But then you see his body just lying there lifeless. And then 2 seconds later, they send in guys in hazmat suits spraying a bunch of insecticide around. So that way they can get the two main characters out of there. And so from then on, yeah, they get them out of there. They're survivors, and then they set the building on fire, and then they talk about, like, will this ever happen again? And the scientist says, like, highly unlikely. You know, you kill the main nesting ground. You know, the lone few survivors there are of these ants, it's probably not going to be a big deal. And it kind of made me think at that point, it's like, a better version of this movie is The Birds. You know? Like, in The Birds, they don't really have any clear motivation as to why the birds are attacking. And the movie just kind of wraps up with them, you know, the main characters who survived getting into their car at safe ground, and then they take off into the sunset. But this one, it's like, okay, ants, as creatures, you could probably make it work. But most of the time, you make it work in a movie that's kind of ridiculous. Like, for example, you look at something like Empire of the Ants, which had ants get exposed to some kind of toxic waste, which then turns them giants, and they then have the ability to control people's minds, and they're trying to take over the world. It's silly, but, you know, there is that part of your brain where you can kind of accept it. It's like, okay, it's a dumb science fiction movie, whatever. You know, as long as it's entertaining, you could probably put that thing aside. The problem is, some of this movie just kind of comes off boring. Like, it's just kind of dull in a lot of spots. Not that the characters are bad or anything, it's just that it doesn't really do a whole lot. It's, you know, it takes a while for the actual ants to, like, do anything. And on top of that, it's like, it is a movie about killer ants. And ants aren't very interesting insect killers. I mean, it's not like movies like The Swarm where, okay, people are afraid of bees, and people are obviously afraid of something like spiders because they're naturally creepy. So you got movies like Arachnophobia or Eight-Legged Freaks or whatever. But ants, in comparison, not really super interesting killers. Again, it can be done, but sometimes it only works when you make it really silly. But with that said, I do kind of appreciate that the movie was trying to take itself seriously. Didn't make it any better. I'm just saying I appreciated the fact that, I mean, for a movie with a kind of silly premise of killer ants, at least tried taking it somewhat seriously, versus nowadays where even the serious horror movies have to have, like, quippy dialogue and try to have characters occasionally poke fun at tropes in horror films. It's like, yes, it worked back when Scream did it, but Scream came out in the late 90s, so, you know, back then it was kind of cutting edge. Nowadays it's like, we've heard it before. And just because you point out cliches doesn't automatically make the cliches any better. You have to be really, like, James Gunn level clever with that kind of thing. But I digress. The point is, I appreciated the fact this movie had some decent characters in it. I appreciated the fact that it was trying to be serious, despite a kind of silly premise. The biggest problem is, it's just kind of boring, and then when you really break it down, it feels like that they kind of set up some rules, and they don't really go into it a whole lot. And yeah, the shark in Jaws didn't really have any proper motivation. It was just a shark that was doing what it does best. It eats, it keeps moving, and it makes baby sharks. But here it's like, they kind of mention that, oh, maybe the ants are doing it as an act of revenge against man because, oh, humans are encroaching on insect territory or whatever, but that's just one throwaway line. They don't really do anything with it. So, yeah, some of it's a little bit like, okay, well, wait, why is this happening? Well, shut up. That's really how it feels sometimes, but whatever. I mean, for a cheap 70s TV movie about killer ants, it's about exactly what I expected. It wasn't a horrible movie. I was at least able to sit through it all, and it was certainly not frustrating. It was just kind of like, okay, what? And then after a while, it's just like, all right, whatever. Movie's almost over. That's the other thing. The last 20 minutes, it really feels like the movie would have just ended right then and there if literally everyone, single file, worked their way onto that, you know, that fire truck ladder. But no, they had to drag it out for another 20 minutes. Then that way the movie would clock in at least an hour and a half. But anyway, yeah, ants or Panic at Lakewood Manor, or Attack at Lakewood Manor, or It Happened at Lakewood Manor, whatever it's called. Not horrible. It is certainly better than another 70s horror movie that I reviewed. It's way better than Oasis of the Zombies. Oh my god, that movie had really stupid stuff in it and still somehow managed to be boring. So thank God it was nowhere near as bad as that movie. Screw that movie. I can't stress that enough. That movie was terrible. This movie was not great, but I could at least watch it from beginning to end and not be frustrated at it. So it had that going for it at least. Tune in next time for the next Media Whiz. It is going to be a review. It is going to be a review of an animated film, and it's going to be kind of revisiting some familiar ground. It is another family comedy targeting the, oh look, we're making fun of fairy tale tropes and adding some contemporary jokes to it. We talked about Shrek the Third, we talked about Hoodwink 2, and now we're going to another movie in that vein. We're going to Happily Never After. But until then, guys, I'm the Media Whiz, because one art form wasn't enough.